pleasure to moderate this panel on Armenian Golgotha, which is the memoir of Grigoris Balakian, Peter's great uncle, on the Armenian genocide, written in 2 volumes, and the first volume was published privately in Armenian in 1922, and so volume 1 was written sometime between 1918 and 1920, possibly, and volume 2 wasn't published until 1959 in French.
No, in Armenian.
And I was just discussing with Peter on the way here that we're not really quite sure when volume 2 was written. It might have been written after. To me, reading the narrative, to me, it seems like it's a very different text and it was written afterwards. We're not sure. But what the volume does, both volumes do for me anyway, they signal something new in the Armenian genocide, in the narrative of the Armenian genocide, but also very valuable text for genocide studies. So with our 3 panels, we should have 4, but we'll see. First of all, we're going to have Armenian, who is the chairperson and professor of philosophy at Southern Connecticut State University in New Haven. And Armin is going to be looking at passages from Armenian Golgotha that provide elements against claims that the Armenian genocide is an unintended consequence of
Thank you, Donna. Here, formally, I want to just speak informally about what I found in this work and why I think it's important. Armenian Golgotha is unique in the sense that it's unlike many survivor memoirs and testimonies that I've read, and certainly I've read quite a few, both about the Armenian genocide survivors, even memoirs of my own family that I've had that are not published, but also other genocides. Now, what makes this work unique? There are a number of aspects of this work that I think stand out. First, the breadth of the work. Balakian was present from the beginning, or the symbolic beginning, of the Armenian genocide on April 24th, 1915 in Constantinople. He was one of the group of 250 intellectuals, political leaders, artists that were arrested and then sent to prison in Chankari, in the interior. So he provides a sort of important window on that group of intellectuals and leaders. But he was also, I say there's the breadth of the coverage of the work in the sense that he was also present throughout the whole period, really in the heart of where the genocide took place. He traveled along the deportation routes. He experienced the extensive genocide that took place in the province of Ankara. It had a very sort of unique perspective on these events because he became somewhat of the leader and the spokesman of the group of arrested deportees. In a sense, he traveled through the heart of the killing fields, and because of the geography of Anatolia, there were particular limited routes of these deportation routes. So when he was going on the deportation route with his group after they left Chankari and after a group of Yozgat deportees merged with their group, he followed the path of the caravans of deportees that had traveled before. He had been back in Chankari at the time when the genocide began, and was in Chankri over the period when the major deportations took place. So he was traveling on the road that had already been traveled by hundreds of thousands of other deportees. So he, in a sense, saw the aftermath of what had happened. In many cases, saw the bones of those who were killed in the prior year, and also was able to talk with many of the individuals along the way, both on the perpetrator's side and those who were passive observers of what had happened. So in a sense, he was absorbing all the events in this central corridor where much of the genocide took place. The other thing that makes it unique is that we have a clear look into the mind of the perpetrator here, because Balakian was able, through his interpersonal skills, to begin a conversation, a long conversation, with the police chief from Yozgat, Captain Shukri, who had been one of the chief individuals who had carried out prior caravans and massacres. And there's a long 20-30 pages of descriptions of conversations he had with this perpetrator leader, being able to get his confidence, and the frankness of what Shikari tells him is just amazing, because in a sense he didn't believe that Balakian was ever going to survive this.
Here he is.
Oh.
He's sorry, I really did. I'm sorry.
Come on. So he never thought that Balakian was going to survive. So he was very clear in describing in detail, down to the particular numbers of individuals that he was responsible for massacring, 86,000 in Yozgat, to even the number of ox carts they used, details of how they organized the massacre, in particular how they killed the women, how they deceived the population so it made it easier to commit the atrocities. And in that sense, we get a clear view into the genocidal intent of the perpetrators, into the mens rea, the guilty mind of the perpetrator. The other thing that makes it unique is Balakian's vast knowledge of Anatolian landscape, both political and geographic, sociological, anthropological. Balakian, because of his work with the church, he was very involved with the patriarch in Constantinople, and had been sent to various places in Anatolia. So he was very familiar with the vast landscape of Anatolia, the towns, the people, the populations, the different ethnic groups. And also because of his training in Germany, both as an engineer first and then his theological training, he was very, very familiar with the German language and the German culture, which helped him survive, because he was able to get assistance from many of the German workers and engineers there that were building the railroad to Baghdad. But he also was able to understand the sort of the German role and the German perpetrator role in the massacres. But this vast knowledge of Anatolia also gives this book a lot of factual detail that you don't find in the memoir. You know, you don't find the kind of population figures, which would have been available in the Patriarchy in Constantinople, the Armenian populations of the different churches that were spread across Anatolia. So he, in a sense, knew what it was like with a vast picture before the genocide began. So when he's writing his memoir, he's able to give that kind of detailed knowledge that you would only think a historian doing archival work years later could provide. And it makes it unique in that he has a personal voice, but he also has so many of the facts at hand, given his background and his involvement in the church. So that's what makes this piece very unique. But what I wanted to just focus on to finish with is the fact that in this work, Balakian provides many arguments against all the current denialist claims by the Turkish government and the scholars that work for the Turkish government, the propagandists that work for the Turkish government directly or indirectly. And there are quite a few things I could point out, but I wanted to look first at the notion that one of the claims made by the denialists is that there was a civil war going on. There was a lot of chaos. Many of the caravans were guarded by inexperienced soldiers, gendarmes, who failed to carry out orders. And the claim is that the orders were not for the extermination and execution of the Armenians. The orders were deportation orders, and they just were poorly carried out. He makes it clear that, and I'm not going to go through the pages to cite these things, it makes it clear that much of what was already going on in terms of the initial massacres had already begun before the cover of the parliamentary order in May with regard to the deportation. And then he also makes it clear in a number of places, including one point where he conveys one of the Chankari deportees. This is on page 79. Is actually is able to read one of the secret follow-up orders that followed the initial public order of the deportation. The secretaries of the CUP party, the Idiot, had various important clubs and officials in the various towns. And they were the ones, in a sense, who were the prime forces behind the actual massacres. And they often wound up playing a role in having usurping the authority of the provincial government officials. But he reads this. He's able to read this text and conveys it here verbatim, in which it says, "Without mercy and without pity, kill all from the 1-month-old to the 9-year-old, but see to it that the massacre is not conducted in the towns and in the presence of people." These are the kinds of remarks that we see in a number of places that puts a lie to the idea that what took place was a matter of people not carrying out orders. What took place actually was the carrying out of those particular orders. There is much that's made in the denialist literature about the Armenian rebellion. And you get the impression when you read a lot of the material produced by the denialists that there was a civil war going on. The Armenians had revolted in all the towns and cities across Anatolia. They were undermining the war front against the Russians. And one of the excuses given was that there were armed Armenians in each of the towns. And again, in the text, the pretext of disarming the Armenians is used really as a precursor to removing the population. And there's an incident on page 107 where the police chief in Chankri is ordered to go and search all the houses and find guns. And they don't find any guns. And there's a follow-up to it saying, well, what are you doing here? You need to plant guns in order to find the guns. So it says, if you cannot find weapons in the Armenian households, you can at least take some weapons with you and plant them in the Armenian homes, and then make an official police report saying so. Aren't you aware of the official policy? So again, this is at the time there were things being done to set up the cover story, and Balakian is very good in revealing those things going on at that time. And there are photographs that denialists use showing them the stocks of guns that were confiscated from the Armenians. As an aside, my grandfather was a photographer in Anatolia, an Armenian photographer, who was drafted and worked for the government. And one of the jobs he and his brother had to do was to go and photograph the guns that were dug up in the Armenian cemetery that were supposedly planted there for the rebellion. And in my great-uncle's memoir, it points out that they took the photographs, but they said this is absurd because these guns don't even have dirt on them, let alone rust, if they were buried for a number of months in the cemetery. So it was all clearly this attempt to give a cover story to what would happen. Now, there are many more of these things I can point out, but one that I might want to conclude with is the notion that there was equal or even greater victimization on the part of Armenians and the Turks, and the Turks of Armenians. And the figure often is used that there were 2.4 million Muslim victims in Anatolia during World War I, and that there are always attempts to diminish the number of Armenians. And I'm not denying the fact that there were many Turkish casualties in Anatolia at this time. Some of them directly as a result of the Russian and the Armenian volunteer soldiers that were invading the Turkish lands. But the overwhelming number of those casualties were caused by, in a way, the negligence and possibly even the intentional culpability of the Turkish authorities. And a good example is given, I believe this is on page 357, in which, quite sympathetically, Balakian discusses the plight of the Turkish deportees, the Turks that were forced out of the provinces that the Armenians had invaded. And he describes how these poor refugees were left in rags in camps themselves, while the authorities and the corrupt officials were, in a sense, living high on the wealth that they had appropriated from the Armenians. He writes, While the Armenian people had been driven by the Turks to the deserts to perish, these Turkish and Kurdish refugees were subjected to their misery where they were. I often saw the sick, homeless, abandoned, and deprived of care lying prostrate in the frozen flagstone courtyards of the mosques. No one paid any attention to these wretched people. Meanwhile, government officials were saying, we won't get an opportunity like this again, and went on plundering the Armenians. For the sake of appearances, the government gave these hapless ones a daily ration of 100 grams of mixture of bread, straw, and earth, which looked like mud, and a soup called chorba, moral. The Turkish government had no more compassion for these poor people than they did for the Armenians. Instead of dying by fire or execution, they would perish from starvation and disease. This wretched, docile multitude had not understood the actual intent of its leaders. So this is again pokes a big hole in the story of the denial. The fact that there were that great a number of casualties in the Turkish and Kurdish side is not, even if the figures are correct, it's hard to attribute all those numbers to the actions of the Armenian volunteer battalions that were associated with the Russian invasion. I could point out a few more things, but I want to let the other panelists speak. But it is, as I said, a very unique memoir, one that you won't encounter very often because of the fact that both Balakian had this great perspective, but also had the ability to see behind the events that were happening directly around him, see the greater context, see the story of denial being created right before his eyes. Thank you.
So now it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Pam Maclean, who's a senior lecturer at the School of History, Heritage and Society at Deakin University in Melbourne. She's going to be looking at so-called privileged victims.
I feel a little bit of a fraud here because I'm not a scholar of the Armenian genocide and the Armenian genocide isn't my field. On the other hand, and I think that's why I'm here, together with Don and other colleagues at Deakin, we've conducted considerable research into video testimonies given by Holocaust survivors. And I think it's from that perspective, of the comparative perspective with other testimonial types of literature of genocide, that I'm coming to my comments here. Now, as a memoir, as a testimony, the memoir, I think, consists of a sort of pastiche of autobiographical writing, much of which is concerned with institutional church politics. But to me, reading this, looking for accounts of first-hand witnesses of genocide or murder, I suppose, as opposed to genocidal suppression, what struck me was that the limited first-hand account of witnessing, or that first-hand account of witnessing genocide was relatively limited. But what was interesting, and Armin also mentioned this, was the frequent interpolation of other eyewitness accounts of atrocity. But there are also some rather, get shot here, long-winded, I think, historical observations that there is, and it, as a form of writing, it's actually very uneven in terms of the structure. I'm not making a value judgment here, but in terms of how to read it and how to understand this account and how to, put it together poses some interesting questions. It is very much a product, the style of writing of its time. I've read, I suppose, a number of accounts of the First World War, often from German perspective or German Jewish perspective, and this form of writing is actually quite common. Now, from the perspective of comparisons with Holocaust first-person testimony, and usually video testimony, I want to make some points, and then I want to make some specific points about a couple of issues and passages. Memoir writing, that is, writing after the event and thinking about what occurred, in comparison with first-person testimony, even when one is talking about witnessing of traumatic events, can, by its very nature, because one has had time to think, digest, craft, can lack some of the immediacy and spontaneity and emotional effect that can arise in an interview with a survivor, where that survivor is telling the story for the first time. And this is what Theriault describes as the essence of the current witnessing trope in the 20th century as the age of the witness. So it's dominated by audio-visual medium, with the interviewer too seeking to elicit response and effect. By contrast, the memoir is essentially monological, although, clearly in the case of the Balakian one, there is a sort of imagined dialogue with his fellow Armenians, or the Armenian nation. But unlike enacted testimony, it can at times have a slightly flat, almost homogenised quality. And I remember this most clearly with a video testimony that I listened to that was given to a fellow. It was his first time he'd ever told his story. And it went for 9.5 hours, and it's a Holocaust story. It was absolutely fantastic. I read his written memoir of exactly the same events, and it just, by the retelling and the writing, it had lost that immediate effect. Not that the memoir wasn't important, but in terms of the nature of the medium, it was a very interesting comparison can be made. Now, the frequent juxtaposition of historical political context and opinion into this genocide narrative reinforces the fact that Balakian sees his task, and this is what Armin was talking about, as making a broader sense, contextualising of what he cannot be explained. And you see this also with Holocaust survivors who may be taking a group around to a Holocaust display or museum and feel obliged to tell stories about aspects of the Holocaust that they didn't see, they didn't experience themselves, because they're trying to make some broader sense of the Holocaust. I think the third point, general point I want to make is I think a distinction can be made between memoirs which have sort of literary aspirations, most notably something like Prima Levi's work, and more non-literary works. And I think I would place Balakian, despite some very vivid and effective passages of writing, more in the latter category of other non-literary work. It lacks, I think, some consistency of tone, and in places could have benefited at the time from a good edit. So this raises the general question of how do we read this book? Do we read it primarily as a sort of historical document of its time, or does its greatest value, and I think here I perhaps would differ with Armin, does its greatest value lie as a work which provides insight into the problems of writing about such events, where other models of writing and talking about them may not exist? Now, these observations frame what I want to raise as my main discussion point, which is Grigoris Balakian's difficult position as a community leader who commands the respect of his, and he uses the term frequently, flock, but, and somewhat uncomfortably for me, and this would be just me, because of his privileged position, is in active dialogue with perpetrators, as Armin says, which gives him access to hearing important things, but also which enables him, and also enables him to ameliorate the conditions of his flock. Yet ultimately, and perhaps problematically, this is what allows him to save himself and enables him to escape. And here on my thoughts, I must acknowledge I have a PhD student, Adam Brown, who is actually doing research into this category of privileged Jews, and who by virtue of their position, were able to survive. And this has raised a number, I think, of interesting questions. I am not making a value judgment about people in these circumstances. I'm simply drawing attention to the questions that their situation raises. So I'm going to do this by highlighting two passages from the book. His account of how he learned the horrendous details of the Golgotha massacre already referred to, and his descent into the valley of Tash-Dumas. Paradoxically, of course, had Balakian not been able to draw on his privileged status, specifically because he was a prelate within the church, Balakian would not have had access to much of the information he recounts, and most likely would have been murdered and unable to write the memoir. So that's always the paradox and the dilemma. Balakian's exercise of a communal leadership role arguably also reveals the extent to which he has internalised the broader role of the Armenian Church under the Ottomans as agents of Ottoman secular rule while attempting to preserve religious integrity. And here I found useful an article by Simon Payazian, the destruction of the Armenian Church during the genocide, published in Genocide Studies and Prevention. Indeed, I was struck by the relatively small role, because that's how I thought I was going to read this, of Balakian's Christian vocation, as opposed to his preoccupation with the politics of the institutional church. What a relatively small role is seen to play in his account. Yes, we have the recurring image of the Armenian Golgotha or Calvary, but otherwise references to his Christian beliefs are remarkably or relatively limited, and this seems to be different from the way in which Jewish Holocaust memoir internalises the Holocaust as a Jewish experience, not just a religious experience, not a cultural and national, or no, putting this badly, not as well as a cultural and national experience. Okay, now I'm going to look at the relationship to the perpetrator. In the first passage that I'm going to talk about, Balakian describes how during the journey of his group of Armenians from Chankiri to their demise, he accompanies Captain Shukri, a self-confessed genocidaire, ostensibly to solicit the captain's account of the Golgotha genocide event. Balakian presents himself, and this I find very interesting, as somehow in control of that relationship, and I quote, I asked Shukri Bey how the women and girls of Yozgat were massacred. While travelling this road to death, I was intent on learning everything I could about the martyrdom of my race. I was thinking too that it was possible somehow to survive. I might shed light on these criminal events. A piece of testimony like this from the actual place of killing and from a killer who had overseen the deaths of 42,000 Armenians in the Sanjak of Yozgat could be valuable. It was riding on horseback that had given me the unique opportunity. All those who have travelled long days by horseback know that a horseman on a journey always seeks out a fellow rider to relieve the boredom. At times when I separated from him, he would invite me back over so that we would continue talking and riding together. He was candid with me, as he himself stated, because he was convinced that none of us would survive. He treated me respectfully, not out of sincerity or respect for my position as prelate, and he continually talks about his position, but because he was trying to extort us without resorting to violence. In order to win his favour, I told him I had always been a Turcophile and I had been exiled from Constantinople because I had been mistaken for a revolutionary with the same name. I even told him I had been decorated by Sultan Hamid himself. I criticised the extremist acts of the Armenian revolutionary committees and told him that the Armenian revolutionaries were the sole cause of our misfortune. I seem to have succeeded in winning Captain Shukri over because he said to me, using the Armenian word confidentially, even if I'm not able to respect your companions from the murderous mob, I'll save you as long as you convert to Islam. I want this to be understood. Whatever proposal he made, I responded affirmatively. I even demonstrated my knowledge of the Quran, which delighted him. And this is the paragraph that I find really problematic. I want to underscore that I made every effort to remain alive, but with the hope that I would emerge from all of this with my honour intact and not as an apostate. However, I do not want to judge all of the other surviving Armenians. It was enough that they should save themselves any way they could. And then what follows is a verbatim account of Shukri's story interspersed with Balakian's questions. And it's a very interesting narrative technique. Now, just thinking points on this. Is there something disconcerting about how Balakian positions himself as the recipient and the reteller of the story? How are we to interpret Balakian's protestations of innocence in the final paragraph quoted? Then, the descent into Tasht al-Mars. As his journey proceeds, Balakian experiences further tragedy and seems on the verge of being murdered. Because of his prominent position, however, he is able to gain assistance to escape certain deportation to the desert and death. Disguised as a German, he travels to safety by train, and retaining his disguise, he obtains position working on the railroads. Then, fearful of being identified by other Armenians and endangering his helpers, he decided to seek refuge in the isolated valley of Tasht al-Mars, the location of a water pump. The second passage from the chapter movingly reveals the depth of Balakian's torment and draws together many of the narrative strategies and themes evident in the wider narrative. Now, I haven't got time to read this, it's on pages 320 to 321, but the gist of it is, alone in this valley and with the assistance of one Armenian who helps him operate the water pump, he becomes extremely depressed, ill, has to be taken back out of the valley, and he discovers that all the Armenians around him actually knew that he was this leading prelate. He thought he was in disguise. And once he is rescued, he then stays in a hospital, is hidden as a German in a hospital, and for the rest of the, for a considerable period until he can leave. And this brings me to my last comment about reading or watching survivor testimony. Is there some obligation to like the witness, to like the person who's giving the testimony? This may seem like a trivial point, but there can be a tendency to idealise the victim because they're a victim. If you think about Frank, whose story was sanitised, you know, the adolescent fantasies were sanitised from her diary. Or, most notably, Victor Klemperer's diary of his time in Dresden. And Victor Klemperer, who describes his Holocaust experiences in Dresden, he was a few Jews who spent the whole Holocaust in Germany. He drives me mad. He's self-absorbed, he's a misogynist, and has many other personal features which are most unattractive. But it is a gripping account and really helps you to understand these situations. In the case of Balakian, I found myself both compelled by the stories that he was telling, yet annoyed by his, to me, petty concerns about institutional church policies, his tendency to talk about people kissing his ring, the devotion of the Armenian people to him, his situation of privilege, which I think, although he every so often he tries to deny it in the book, he takes for granted. So, I think you should all read the book, but I'd be very interested in some of your responses.
Thanks, that's great. Henry Theriault is Associate Professor at the Philosophy Faculty at Worcester State College in Massachusetts, and he's going to be looking at certain passages that function on the same level as scholarly texts, and a bit more from the
And, you know, that book is, I think, one that a lot of Armenians use in that way because it's written in a way that's not, I mean, it's horrifying as anything on genocide is, but it's also not so graphic that maybe, you know, a teenager will be horrified so much that they won't be able to kind of deal with what's going on. I'm thinking in terms of things like sexual violence and so forth. I think the Survivors book by Miller and Miller is also an excellent introduction because it has, I think, chilling but also very insightful survivor testimony as well as some overarching kind of theoretical frameworks that help people understand the genocide, but understand it in a very human way. But that's a challenge because it is very specific. I mean, it really lays out, I mean, every aspect of the horrors of the Armenian genocide, and it's too much, I think, for a younger person coming to this. And as I was reading this book, I was thinking there's a lot of very challenging passages in terms of the intense, you know, nature of the violence and how it's described. But it's not as much as some other survivor testimonies in a lot of cases. And I'm thinking this may be the book that I would introduce at the right age to kind of give an idea of the Armenian genocide, because it combines, I think, in a really profound way, a kind of overarching analysis of what was happening, as well as a kind of on-the-ground report of the everyday lived experiences of people trying to survive in the Armenian genocide and witnessing others who didn't. And I think that combination is very important. It deals with major perpetrators as well as just people in villages who commit violence. It deals with you know, kind of personal eyewitness perspective as well as much broader kind of visions about what's going on. It deals very well, I think, with the complexities of the Turkish population, Turkish leadership, and so forth, with Germans who were in the Ottoman Empire at that time, distinctions between military officers, military, soldiers, underground soldiers, railroad employees, and so forth. And also a kind of very complex presentation of Armenians, traitorous Armenians who are actually serving, the Turkish government to help perpetrate the genocide, people who were struggling to survive, people who helped others survive, a whole gamut. It really gives a very nuanced picture of all of the population, which is not always true of accounts, including survivor accounts. So that's maybe the first note to start with. Now, that isn't to say the book doesn't raise some complexities, some challenges that we have to think through to follow what others have said. I think one of the questions that you have to start with in this book is, how does it work as a historical source? That is, how are we to trust or understand what Balakian has presented in this book? Is it a first-hand account that we can treat as a kind of a set of factual data of the genocide? Is it something else? And I think, for me, one of the tensions that emerges, particularly in the first maybe 100 pages or so in this book, is a tension between Balakian's direct experiences that he's relating and a kind of hindsight or framework that he's bringing to his experiences, which of course is a tension that's not unique to this book. A framework that he's bringing to his experiences to try to make sense of them. Okay? And to give you an idea, for instance, on page 77 of the text, he lays out a kind of 8-point discussion of the different elements of the Armenian genocide, which are very scholarly and very kind of abstract, and don't seem to come from anything he had experienced prior to that point. That is, there are things that seem to come from reflection and reading and things like that after his experiences as he tries to make sense of them. That's not necessarily bad or good, but it's good to understand that this isn't just a kind of narrative of his experiences as they happen, but there's more going on. Page 98, for instance, there's a discussion he has with the deputy Muhtasarif, who is hinting that Balakian and his companions' understanding of what's going on is too limited at this point. He's hinting that there's a genocide coming, but in fact can't say it directly as a government official. He doesn't say it outright. And Balakian, at different points in that first 100 pages or so, kind of says different things at different points. At some points he says, hey, I understood what was going on, and I saw this happening, and I looked at other people who were being naive, I argued with them, they didn't get it. At this point in the text, he seems to himself kind of recognize his own naivete. He didn't understand what was happening. This official was trying to tell him, hey, this is not just some, deportations or arrests of elite leaders. This is not just a limited kind of thing. It's not even what happened in 1894-96 with large-scale but targeted massacres. This is bigger. And, I can't say anything more, but you understand what I mean, don't you? Kind of thing. There are other places where he says things that he might not have been able to know. For instance, on page 180, he's talking about a Kesari caravan of Armenians who, by and large, chose not to accept conversion to Islam, which apparently was offered to them, and instead, as he puts it, were willing to go to Deir Zor, knowing that that was death for them. At this point, it's not clear that Balakian could have known that. At this point, when he's witnessing that. Okay? So there's a tension there. There are other kinds of things. He mentions Morgenthau and the Royce Toynbee report towards the end of the book as well. And so maybe he had read those as he's trying to do this, and that influenced how he saw things. And that's one thing that deniers sometimes try to pick up on. And there's also a kind of another framework element that I think is important. And it's a kind of Christian resurrection theme that's mediated through a kind of Armenian nationalism. That is that through this process of genocide, the lucky survivors will make it to the kind of promised land or the ultimate kind of rebirth of an Armenian nation somehow. And very touchingly, the last parts of this book talk about his disappointment up until 1922, but that doesn't happen. Quite the opposite. Perpetrators by and large get away with the crime. Armenians basically get subjected to new horrors and so forth. But again, we have to think, okay, is that framework something he's taking? It's a Christian framework, really Christian, and it's also an Armenian kind of nationalist framework. Not that I'm not sympathetic to it in those ways or anything like that. These aren't necessarily, any worse than any other framework. But we have to be aware that maybe that framework is kind of coming in here. And this is one of the reasons that, for instance, people like Balakian, a well-known scholar of the Armenian genocide, and many other scholars are very hesitant and, in fact, often refuse to use survivor and eyewitness, kind of unofficial eyewitness testimony in developing what they consider accurate historical accounts of the Armenian genocide and other cases. We can understand their logic. They look at things like court records, they look at diplomatic dispatches, they look at official government reports and so forth, under the, on the view that these are things that are tested in ways that eyewitness and survivor accounts aren't. They're done by people who aren't directly involved, typically, in what's going on, and so they're more somehow objective. Okay? But as I switch gears here, I'm not sure that's an accurate criticism. And in fact, whatever Balakian's framework, I think that a lot comes through whatever framework he had chosen to use. And I think that even if you look at the diplomatic history of dealing with the Armenian genocide, and I see Ambassador Evans here, who probably can speak to this very well. You look at the work by Morgenthau, Jackson, and Davis, and you look at the constraints that they were under, and the reports we get from them that are so incredibly powerful about the Armenian genocide are the points where they kind of slip beyond the constraints that were placed on them and react on a kind of more human, although very intellectual level to what was going on. Okay? In a lot of other cases, if you look at the kind of diplomatic and official records of the Armenian genocide, they are just as limited in their own way. They're just as biased. In many cases, they're biased from a kind of statist, governmental perspective. For instance, a lot of German documentation, blames Armenians. I mean, are factually incorrect because of the framework that's imposed. Now, I'm not saying, that there's any way to necessarily get beyond that, but I don't think Balakian is any more guilty of anything like that than any of the best sources that people consider standards in dealing with this. And I think, like Morgenthau and Davis and others, the human brute reality of what he sees kind of transcends or pushes through any framework that he tries to impose on it. That is, you get a kind of, as much as possible, a kind of raw experience of what he saw and his attempt to make sense of it that isn't constrained and isn't tainted by what's the frameworks that he has available to him. And remember, this is a guy going through genocide. He didn't have a chance to study this. Nobody had a concept of this. And he's trying to make sense of why he's watching thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people die around him. And so those frameworks are available and they develop and so forth. And it would be an interesting paper beyond the scope of what we're doing here to talk about how his frameworks change, how they're influenced by his experiences and so forth. I would go beyond that, though, that Balakian offers us something here that may well be unique, and maybe only in Morgenthau and a very few other eyewitness testimonies do you see anything like this. Here.
It's like another 5 minutes.
5 minutes, yeah, great. And I'm just going to just quickly touch on this. I have a lot of examples of this kind of thing. He offers very sophisticated analysis of a lot of the aspects of the Armenian genocide. I was going to give quotes and stuff, but let me just talk about what he does. For instance, the use of disease by the perpetrators. I mean, the intentional setting up of context, for instance, camping Armenians in swamps where they were likely to get disease, which is an incredibly important thing that's not well documented and not well kind of analyzed in the literature. He provides repeated, direct evidence with analysis of that, and he understood what was happening. The various ways in which the CUP, the Young Turks, deceived people inside and outside of Turkey about what was happening. The use of secret orders and so forth, which he is able to identify while it's happening, which I think is also very significant, and which hasn't really come to light until much later scholarship. He's much on the cutting edge here. The calculation of numbers. There's one scene on page 342 where he's sitting with a friend of his, and they're trying to actually figure out how many Armenians have been killed, how many are alive, based on all the discussions they've had with people, all that they've witnessed, and so forth. And they give as good estimates as pretty much anybody has been able to give, which is remarkable for the situation. Many other kinds of things. We're dealing with contemporaneous denial arguments, which Armin has talked about. Premeditation issues, the trauma of victims, the cruelty of the perpetrators, and so forth. I mean, there's a tremendous amount there. And I think beyond that, what Balakian does is he interviews perpetrators. And he interviews them in an extremely intelligent, probing, careful way that would make any social scientist writing about genocide now very impressed. What I would say is, if you look at the kind of interview questions he asks and the way that he approaches his interview subjects, it's the kind of thing where he's almost, I mean, it's like he's had a year to develop a survey instrument for perpetrators of genocide he's brought into this. I've already mentioned page 149, the Confessions of a Slayer Captain, Shukri, is an incredible passage where he actually is able to gather insights into perpetrator intent at different levels, rationales, mentalities, ethics, and so forth, that really isn't available anywhere else. And this makes, I mean, if nothing else in this book, that makes this work, I think, one of the fundamental primary sources on the Armenian genocide with its publication in English. Certainly, in Armenian it was already there, but it wasn't accessible to a lot of people. I would say there are many other kinds of issues that he brings up that I just like, I got like 2 or 3 minutes to go.
Got to finish.
Okay, okay. I'm sorry?
Go
ahead. Okay, great. I'm pretty close here. I'm pretty
Don't
close.
stress.
I mean, I could mention, you know, his treatment his discussions of the treatment of women, the sexual violence, other kinds of violence against women. Again, giving very, not just what you get in a lot of the eyewitness accounts, and it's horrifying to read, a kind of eyewitness recognition of this, but he then he talks to perpetrators at different points, finds out what were they thinking, how are they feeling about it now. I mean, it's incredibly important for understanding the causes of genocide, how particular perpetrators get involved in genocide, what their motives are, and so forth. And I think that, again, adds so much. I think there are a number of other, and I'm going to be very brief about this, a number of other things that come through in this text that may be new things or that he's discussed in ways that haven't been done before. I think the whole issue of the expropriation of Armenian property and the role of that in the Armenian genocide, which has been researched in different ways, but which is a constant theme in this, where he's able not only to kind of explain this, give almost a kind of statistical analysis of what was taken, descriptions and so forth, and the ways in which this happened, but to talk about its role in the Armenian genocide itself. And along with this, I think and I don't think this has really been written about in the case of the Armenian genocide, probably in a very limited way for other cases, but the economy of survival, the role of who had money, where people were getting money, how they were using money. I mean, it's a weird thing about the Armenian genocide, but people who are on the deportation margins kind of survived in some cases because they had money to buy bread. You know, people would steal from them, they would kill for them to steal, but then other times they would leave them with their money and they would use it to purchase things. It's a very complicated set of things happening, which I think has to do in part with the fact that one of the big motives of the Armenian genocide was this kind of expropriation, particularly for lower level perpetrators. And one of the ways that could be done efficiently was to extort money and steal it, because otherwise, if Armenians knew that if they took their money with them and so forth, it would just be taken away, they would bury it. I mean, there was a big fear among some perpetrators that there was a competition among different perpetrator groups, soldiers versus villagers, about who would get the money. And so soldiers didn't want to just have a massacre at certain points because they knew villagers would be involved and take some of the money, so they would extort it on the deportation routes and things like that. It's a very complicated economy of genocide that comes out of this that I don't think, again, there's a wealth of primary data here that hasn't really been analyzed. And I think that's one place that Balakian doesn't really analyze it. It's a survival process for him. And the last thing, and I'm somebody who, in terms of government things, and probably all of us have a kind of ethical stance and so forth on a lot of issues, and one of them is corruption in government and things like that. Anyone who's familiar with the kind of Armenian government today will understand, there are a lot of corruption issues. That's not unique to Armenia, it's around the world. But one thing reading this book is the extent to which corruption was a tool of survival, and how often the ability to bribe people, Turkish guards, even bandits, people like, and government officials and so forth, was a means of survival, at least temporarily. And this whole, again, a kind of secondary economy of corruption and how that functions in the Armenian genocide, which again has not been researched at all, and yet has an incredible wealth of primary information here that's not really commented upon very much in any of the other eyewitness kind of testimony that's taken as official stuff. Let me stop there. I appreciate your time and your indulgence with my earlier lateness.
Well, Professor Peter Balakian is a professor in humanities, a professor in English at Golgotha University in New York, Hamilton, New York, and is one of the translators of this book along with Iris Selak. And as I said talking about the depth and range of the narrative of Armenian Golgotha, and also issues such as the personal versus the collective.
You know, this has been a process of translation that's gone on for almost a decade, so it's been an interesting journey. It just so happens that the author is my great-great-uncle, so whatever, complexities that creates for the translator, that too has been an interesting journey. And will continue to be interesting as this book unravels and one continues to live in it, because it is rich, it's deep, it's thick, it's rich. In one of the early reviews, one of the reviewers likened it to the equivalent of a Primo Levi or an Elie Wiesel for the Armenian genocide. I think that's it's a fair assessment, not in light of genre, but in gravitas of place in the discourse. It owns a kind of large place in the discourse, and you've been hearing various, reasons why scholars here think this memoir has a sense of unique dimension to it. I want to focus on a few aspects of the persona and the voice that I think are important, and certainly in the annals of the Armenian genocide discourse, unique and unusual in the survivor memoir period in the broader sense. I also think, as a book written in 1918, first volume, 1918-1921, historically this is groundbreaking. The assessments about genocide that Grigoris Balakian is making have simply not been made in some sense, for some obvious reasons. The event itself is unprecedented in certain ways, and he's grappling with that and defining that as he writes this narrative. I agree with Henry, too, that one of the things that continue, I promise I'll try not to be responding to everybody, but, the configuration of mediated retrospective analysis with first-hand testimony is one of the most interesting processes of translating this memoir, too, for us. We're continually traveling that weed, if you will, that the memoir is made of. But more on some of these issues later. But first I want to note that I think the memoir offers a kind of polyphonic acoustic. That is, Grigoris Balakian is a very good listener to others. He is a pastor, and he's trained to do listening. And you will find this memoir shaped by many voices. You have his voice, the narrator, and it's an interesting voice and an interesting style, and more on that later. But you also then have the various voices he's listening to. Of course, there are voices of Armenian survivors, children who wake up out of piles of corpses, having been left for dead, and are wandering in these, miasmic landscapes, and run into this Armenian priest, and they're just shocked to see an Armenian priest. He does, as Pam has noted, hold a position of high place in the social order of Armenian culture, and his privilege also allows him to hear more voices than perhaps other person in another social order of the society. So he's hearing children's voices, he's hearing the voices of Armenian men and women of various ages. But he's hearing, and you've heard this from Armin and Henry as well, he's hearing the voices of Turks. And this is a very valuable piece of the polyphonic structure of the narrative. Turkish perpetrators, the Captain Shukri chapters, are powerful. I mean, they're interesting, they're engaging, and they're going to keep people dissecting and analyzing for quite a while. You hear the voices of righteous Turks, Turkish mid-level bureaucrats and provincial governors who are trying to warn my great-great-uncle and some of his friends about what is happening and about what is going to happen. I say little, you understand a lot, is the way the Turkish phrase is, the parable is translated. And so, you know, he's encountering these voices. And I will respond, Henry, to your notion of the psychological confusion. That's the first chapters, the first segment of the memoir is defined by as well. I know, but I don't know. He's also hearing the voices of bystanders, of witnessing bystanders. And in this case, German, Swiss, and Austrian engineers and administrators along the Berlin to Baghdad railway, mostly here in the southeastern part of Kilikia, historic Kilikia, near the Syrian border. The railway tunnels are being built frenetically by the German government with the Turkish government's assistance for the war effort. And it is here that my great uncle will hear many bystander voices, and they, of course, these men will help him escape. His fluency in German is no small part of one of the reasons he's able to escape. So you have this what I'm calling a polyphonic acoustic. Secondly, in accord with the kind of range and layering of the narrative voice, you do have a panoramic view. Some of you have also referred to this, but I want to note that the memoir begins in Berlin on July 29 of 1914, just on the eve of the outbreak of World War I. My great uncle is in Berlin studying theology, and of course he is pursuing in the summertime. And so you observe a very interesting context. He's observing, like a pretty good journalist, the complexity, as he sees it, of warmongering and war fever inside of Berlin on the eve of the war. He takes you to some socialist peace rallies. He overhears conversations at cafes. He witnesses the paroxysms of xenophobia as they're erupting in the streets of Berlin. And then after that, he has to leave Germany. You'll go back with him to Constantinople, and you will follow. There is no account more vivid, clean, elegant, and penetrating of the events of the night of April 24, the evening that Armenians symbolically commemorate the Armenian genocide through worldwide today, than this account, than these three chapters. You will follow him from Constantinople by arrest at his house, by bus, then ferry, then train, and by the day or mid to late day of April 25, you will be with him on a train going to the prison at Changari. And you can see the span of the range and span of his witness account. It's a big piece of the terrain of the Armenian genocide. I don't know if there are other memoirs that encompass this terrain. I don't know, and some of you maybe have read more in Armenian and can tell me, but at least for what's available now, there's nothing like this. So you are witnessing a panorama. Now, connected to this panorama is something that I've come to call compacted witnessing, by which I mean Balakian is witnessing and narrating both a very personal experience, and he takes you quite into himself. I find him a very vulnerable, raw, and open character. You're in his anguish, his pain, his grief. In fact, at the end of the memoir, he talks quite perceptively about PTSD, not knowing that term exists, but he's analyzing his own paranoia, his own insomnia. He notes that he's a changed person, and so forth, because of these events. Coming back to this, you're in a very personal voice, and then you fan out into a more panoramic perspective of broad seeing, in which you see often, I think Henry put it well, that there is just a density of atrocity that this memoir is made up of. And you're traveling through landscapes in which there are tens of thousands of loosely buried corpses for miles. And these landscapes are unprecedented, certainly in modern witness literature of this, up until this period. He says at one point, when we realized that these unburied mounds were Armenian men, women, and children, we contemplated suicide. And some of these moments are really, I find, very poignant and acute in that way. So you're moving between what I want to say is also not only the macro and the micro drama, but also the personal and the collective. In that as you follow this journey, you're also witnessing the destruction of the culture of Armenian civilization, of 2,500 years in certain cases. I mean, that's the time span of Armenian civilization in Anatolia. You're not seeing everything as a 2,500-year span, but that's the duration. So, to come back to the panel discussion of this morning about Sarajevo and the Bosnian library, here you are witnessing some of what Raphael Lemkin noted as a component of genocide, which is the destruction of the material culture and the civilization. The churches, the monks, the monasteries, the schools, the buildings, the books, the manuscripts. There are scenes, he has a very fine eye, pieces of shredded Bible pages, wedged under rocks, soaked in blood. I mean, these kinds of images, I believe, are groundbreaking in the annals of this kind of genre of writing. But you see the destruction as well of the intellectuals. Not only the 250 plus from Constantinople, but in the end, more than 2,000 who are systematically arrested with the aid of these prepared blacklists and done away with by the end of 1915. The artists, the writers, the journalists, the clergymen, the teachers. So we are getting a sense, again, in the compacted witnessing of cultural destruction in a kind of relation to the personal and more intimate domestic dimensions of the deportation experience. Along this line, I want to note two more things. One, and again, both Pam and Henry noted that the book has a structure that moves between the personal narrative and some contextualizing analysis. There are chapters that are, about the politics of European Ottoman Empire relations. There are chapters about Armenian Trans-Caucasus history. There are certain chapters that are trying to give you a contextual sense of the year, the edition of the Armenians at the beginning of 1917, and so forth. He obviously felt compelled to try to fuse these two domains of analysis of this event, in some sense overwhelmed by the event. This is one response of structuring narrative. I think what I find here interesting is the rather atypical structure that this blend of perceptions is giving us, but also at its best an added credibility to his voice. For example, he's very critical of the Armenian community, and not only the church community, but of the political parties, of the Armenian populace of Constantinople. He's a tough observer. He's emotional and passionate, but he's not sentimental. And I think the sense of harsh analysis of Armenian culture and Armenian life simply adds to his own gravitas as a public intellectual, a position I think he felt he occupied. I should mention he wrote about 8 to 10 books, so he saw himself as a writer, mostly as a non-fiction writer, and a writer of contemporary affairs and history. He wrote two books on the Balkan Wars. These books are missing, by the way. And one of his other books I do have. I'm holding it for another 30 years before I start translating. Anyway, to give you a sense of that public intellectual critical scrutiny. A couple of observations that I think are worth noting here quickly. That is, as he's listening to the voices of others, he's hearing some pretty compelling stories. In one of the, what I call, Henry was talking about the economy, the kind of microeconomy of the world of deportation. There's also an inner life of human drama to this memoir that is quite a beautiful thread as it undulates through the 71 chapters. In one of these moments, he encounters recently Islamized Armenians who have converted to save their lives, and they're shattered to see this Armenian priest. And they come up to him, begging him for forgiveness and absolution. And he breaks down. Everybody, and I won't try to connect the complexity of the plot here, but they get off stage and they get into a private domestic space. And the anguish, the weeping, it's just truly, powerful stuff. Melville and Faulkner can't do better in some way. And he performs a Holy Communion for them. And it's a surrealistic kind of moment, I won't try to describe it for you. I'll just leave it there. You're going to encounter this moment at some point in the book. Secondly, another piece of listening, and that also suggests to me another dimension of the Lemkinian idea of cultural destruction, because you're seeing a lot of people whose belief value system, in this case Christianity, has been wiped out. Lastly, when he's in disguise as a German soldier, he's listening again. He shaved his clerical, his beard, he's got rid of the shreds of his clerical clothing, and he's dressed as a German soldier. He's going under the name Herr Bernstein, and he's hearing the German soldiers, and he hears them referring to the Armenians as Armenian Jews, as blood-sucking usurers of the Turkish people. And it certainly struck me, as a student of genocide, and a student of anti-Semitism, as one must be if one is studying genocide in the 20th century, how interesting it is to see anti-Semitism transplanted from Germany onto the Armenians as early as 1915. And we know how much Hitler learned from the Turkish idiot leadership about the Armenian genocide. And he learned it through through Germany's own foreign office staff. And this just makes another interesting, flammable connection between the genocide of 1915 and the one of 1940. So with those broad notions here, I will conclude and we'll continue our conversation.
Here that value the book for its representations of events that counter the denial, that show really good descriptions of what genocide is, as Henry pointed out, and then we've got Pam's idea of the role, the privileged genocide victims. So I actually might open the floor up to Pam, actually, rather than get the others to respond, for Pam to respond to one of the other Pam's.
In a way, I don't think I was saying, I was actually disagreeing. As I was listening to Peter, I was thinking, in my haste to finish, I left off the last sentence of my presentation, which was that I thought the value of my thinking about the Balakian situation, perhaps of privilege and perhaps of some of his, what I found perhaps less appealing personal characteristics, in fact affirmed what Peter was talking about, in that what the point I was trying to make was that they demonstrated how deeply human the response to genocide is, and that someone put in such a traumatic situation and with such houses of observation and insight is nonetheless isn't a person with superhuman powers, but is in the end a human being. I just want to make one comment too about the opening of the book, which is sort of draws the circle right back to the connection between the Armenian genocide and anti-Semitism. I was struck in another life. I was quite familiar with Hannah, the theologian, because I don't know, somebody else might recognise Hannah as the theologian who was deeply anti-Semitic and came into controversy, it came into conflict with the major figure in late 19th century, early 20th century attempts at reconciliation or between Germans and Jews, and the whole notion of the German-Jewish symbiosis. There was a Jewish theologian called Hermann Cohen, and he had a very deep dispute with Hannah about the possibilities of a German-Jewish symbiosis.
We did a good footnote from Arne in the book.
Did I?
Yes, I'd like to mention.
Yeah, I wasn't quite certain where you were going in your initial remarks about the fact that there wasn't this immediacy. Unlike some other witness testimony, you were making clearly distinction between witness testimony and memoir. But I guess I was asking, I mean, there was a moment where you said it was absolutely fantastic in describing something in contrast to this, and there was, in a sense, a loss of that immediate effect in the Balakian memoir. But I'm sort of wondering, what is the importance of the immediacy, or what's its value, or what's the value in what? I mean, I suppose if you're approaching it as maybe a literary work, and you're looking for that kind of impact that a literary work has, you might want to privilege that aspect of it and say it was a great read in that sense. But it wasn't clear to me. I mean, it seemed like there was an implied criticism of the work for not being something that it wasn't purported to be.
No.
And maybe I misunderstood that.
No, I wasn't trying to say that. I was trying, because I think this actually links with what Peter was talking about, the personal versus the collective view. So I suppose by immediacy I was thinking about the contrast with expectations of testimony where you is interested in perhaps the response of the individual to what is occurring to them, versus accounts where the individual is locating themselves in a more general story and has the time to do that because of the passive of thinking about and constructing the narrative more carefully. I think that's more what I was talking about, because I felt there were a number of in the book just repeated sorts of elements, which were rhetorical elements, in terms of how he would refer to himself as responding to such and such, or, I mean, rather what we would see now as old-fashioned ways of doing things, of writing, and I think that's also what I was responding to.
I'm going to play. Well, I want to, since we're talking about the writing, then I want to address at this moment, and I'll pass it on to you. Pam, your notion that, you know, this would fall into a non-literary category, which I disagree with. And I think, and your gloss here, your lens here is a Holocaust memoir lens. And I think that one has to contextualize this literarily, historically. I think, you know, and I'm a great admirer of Primo Levi's memoirs and teach them. I think they're really important works. Others are interesting, you know, perhaps not. Levy has set the kind of standard in some way, the high bar for artistic narrative. But those writers had the benefit of literary modernism, and they worked out of literary modernist techniques, not in an experimental way, I mean, not in a Woolfian or Joycean way, but they have absorbed a lot, and especially from a kind of, you know, Central European tradition. I think the Grigoris Balakian literary context belongs to 19th century fictional narrative. That is, this is somebody who read Dickens well, who read Dostoevsky. You can feel Dickens and Dostoevsky seem to be always gurgling under the narrative structures of Armenian Golgotha. I think if you were going to somehow assess the best of the personal narrative chapters, of which there are many, you know, because you do have this movement between the historical analysis and the personal narrative, you have, you know, some very fine, deep, rich, sensual, penetrating structures and language. And you also have some fairly interesting drawing of character and creating dialogue. So I would definitely defend this in its own historical moment as a kind of late Victorian style that has managed to engage the horror of this historical encounter at a high level of prose.
I think, yeah, actually to follow up that, I think there are some really real moments that are handled in a literary way that conveys things that couldn't otherwise be conveyed. And just off the top of my head, there are many passages like this. I'm thinking of the time that Balakian's kind of explanation of the moment that he changes clothes into the German soldier's uniform toward the end, and he talks about how he changed. Right? There's this moment where his identity suddenly changed, his whole sense, and it has to do with his status, how people were looking at him, the level of danger he was under. And I think that's a kind of I'm being very imprecise here, but a kind of a literary moment. That is, it takes more than just a kind of description, even of his internal psychological states, to convey that. And it comes across really, I think, you know,
But it's him looking back.
Well, it's him looking back. What I'm saying is it's a literature.
Yeah.
He's analyzing himself, and he presents it in a kind of literary way. Yes. That is, that he's able to do more than just state the facts of his internal sense of the world and so forth. I think it's very powerful. I would add on the Holocaust thing, I think this is actually a very important document for understanding German militarism and also the potential for righteous protest, which comes out among Germans and other Europeans. Attitudes of racism, even against Turks, which figures very prominently towards the later stages of this novel. I mean, that is German attitudes toward the Turks, which are became very strained in terms of the on-the-ground, military relations and so forth. I think it actually has a lot of value for understanding the kind of pre-existing conditions of the Holocaust. So I would add that. I would say also, I would look at this work in another literary sense in terms of a tremendously creative work in the, not just literarily, but intellectually. Because what King also does is he gives his method, he explains his method as he's using it to understand what's going on in a very self-aware way. There's a passage on, I think it's 358, where he talks about sitting down at one point to try to understand the causes of what he was experiencing and laying out how he's doing that. And there are many other passages where he talks about how he's generating this memoir, which I think is fascinating, regardless of the status. Is it very strong literature or not, and things like that. That creative process in the midst of this horror, I think, is fascinating, and it has a lot of dimensions, one of which I think is very strongly literary. And I think, let's say, there's just so many things that he makes precise through a kind of observational, which in part is literary, an observational ability. You alluded to this. But I'm just thinking, I now know more, and I've read a lot about the Armenian genocide, about April 24. I know more about the use of trains, railways, and what was going on in the Baghdad railway than I've been able to get from a lot of indirect sources. The Turkish villagers' role, there's so much more that's there, and it's presented in a really great way. Yeah, it's just complicated, and I think also Turkish refugees from the Caucasus, there's that scene where he describes refugees who have been victimized, who are starving. And on the one hand, he has this kind of something of a sympathy, but at the same time, he then gives this incredibly precise differentiation between what they were going through and what Armenians were going through that maintains a kind of sympathy for both groups, which I think is incredible. I think talking about dealing with deniers, that level of sophisticated, ethical, material, and other kind of analysis is really valuable. I'm not sure if it's literary or not, but it's got that dimension that his eye you mentioned. Just so precise and sophisticated. I think it's really valuable. So I know there are other people.
Yeah, I actually might take it.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes, sir.
I was curious, and it kind of goes along with the book. What I was going to say too, he speaks as a priest, and it's a personal, I think it's also a different cultural style in which he speaks in that relates to people who are Armenian descent on a very personal level, which I thought was interesting. But I have a question. Why was the author's appendix, or his original appendix, put at the end?
Right. We decided, by we, Aristotle, myself, and my editor, felt that the original author's preface was so intra-Armenian cultural that it was in part a dialogue with his own culture, although it has some stunning insights about writing and the limits of language and the need for burial, and so it has great things in it, but we felt that the tone of it didn't open up the narrative well to a non-Armenian audience. Obviously, we wouldn't leave it out of the text, so we decided to put it in the back. It's almost a sermon.
Yeah.
Ambassador Evans.
I'll cut short what I wanted to say. First of all, thank you to everybody who brought something very valuable to this discussion. I read this book, taking breaks only for sleeping and eating, basically. But now, I have to say, having read it only 2 months ago, I want to read it again, because you have opened my eyes to a lot more complexities. There are all sorts of levels here. Let's just remember also that this really did emanate from history. This is not something he set out to write. And it was written in Armenian. So when you're talking about literary modernism, or you're talking about the style, let's remember that his frame of reference is different, although he spoke German and was familiar with other languages. But I think, Peter, what you have really done is made this so readable for an American audience. It just reads beautifully, and that's your contribution.
Thank you.
When does it come out in Turkish?
Yeah, it's being translated now into Turkish.
Good.
Let me say two things, though.
Just quickly,
Really quickly, because this has been raised twice, and now Ambassador Evans raised it again, that is that this is a memoir that has been used by Dadrian, Akjump, and Kaiser, just off the top of my head, as a primary source. In other words, so those very meticulous historians have found this to be reliable. And I know for Tonner, you know, he begged me for the first 20 chapters because he wanted us, he'd read it and wanted it now again in English so he could look at it, and he used it in A Shameful Act. So I think that speaks also to the place it has, you know, already in the historiography of the scholarship.
Okay. I'd like to thank members of